Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about cartography and maps today. So, cartography is the science or practice of creating a map. And so, cartographers are geographers, and they use the data that geographers gather to create maps. And so the first thing that we have to talk about when we're talking about cartography is scale. This is one thing that cartographers consider when they're drawing their maps or creating their maps. And so the scale is the relationship between the distance on a map, right, a piece of paper or a digital file, and a distance on the Earth's surface. So you may remember back from like 5th grade when they taught you about this thing right here. That is a map scale. And so basically how you read it is a scale of 1 to 100,000 means that 1 unit on the map, so, maybe this far on the map, is equal to 100,000 equivalent units on Earth. Right? So usually those units are subbed in with like miles or kilometers. And data aggregation is the actual act that a cartographer makes when they decide what size of geographic units do I want to be represented on my map. So a map scale is what he or she, the cartographer themselves, will actually come up with once they aggregate their data. Now there are 3 ways to communicate scale. It can be communicated in a fraction, which looks like this ratio right here. 1 over 1.3 million. It can be verbal, which would mean that it would look more like this. So 1 inch on this map is equal to 1,485 miles. Okay, so that's the verbal scale. And then the graphic scale is what I showed you on that last page. It's kind of these notch marks here. We consider that graphically representing scale. But here is the most important thing you need to know about scale. You need to know that geographers use different scales to show different things, okay? So a large scale map, right here is your example. It is actually going to be a small area being shown on that map, and therefore will show more detail. And so I always tell people, remember opposites, right? If it's large scale, it's showing a small area. And then if it's small scale, it's actually showing a large area, okay? Now, these things are always relative, right? Meaning, a small area compared to what? But for the most part, just remember opposites, okay? But here's the thing that you need to know about smaller scales. At a smaller scale, we're looking at a larger area, and that means that our data is going to be a little less reliable and a little more distorted because it's much harder to show a lot of data on a very, very large geographic area. We'll talk more about that. So check this out and, kind of ask yourself, look at the 3 different maps and ask yourself, which one is the largest scale? You may look at it just visually, or you may need to go down here and check out the actual scales written out. But which one do you think is the largest scale? Okay, are you ready for the reveal? This one right here is the largest scale because it is the closest, right? It is showing us the most amount of detail. Remember, if something is large scale, then it's actually showing us a very small area. Okay, so check this out. What if we were to do it in this kind of fractional ratio, right? Which one is going to be the larger scale below? Remember, large scale, small area. So A is the larger scale, right? Because it's showing that 1 unit on the map is equal to 1,000 units in real life, right? Whereas this one is 1 unit on the map is equal to 100,000 real units in life. Okay, so check out this map. Notice this is Oak Hills Historic District. right? And so you can see here, this is basically our school district in the homes that comprise it, okay? So ask yourself, is this large scale or small scale? You should have thought large scale, right? Because this is great detail. This is a small community that we're looking at. Okay, last practice round. Is this large scale or small scale? And so hopefully you were able to determine this is small scale because it's a map of the entire world. Okay, so the next kind of category that we need to talk about when we're considering maps is the type of map that we are looking at. Okay, so there are two main types of maps. And so the first one is a reference map. Now, reference maps are used to show the absolute location of certain places or features. Okay, so reference maps are things like political and physical maps. So here you can see mountain ranges in Europe. This shows major cities in these states, and here shows the same exact thing. Okay, political and physical maps are reference maps. We use them to see where things are. Now, the next category of maps are thematic maps. And thematic maps we use less to see where something is geographically located and more to figure out a story, right? So thematic maps are oftentimes going to make an argument about something. And so they're more helpful for seeing or considering what an area is like rather than where it's geographically located. And so let's talk about the different kinds of thematic maps. The first is a dot map. And so you can see we've got lots of dots here, and each dot represents some frequency of a variable, right, or feature. And so when this variable is more dense, you can see there are more dots. When this variable is more spread out, you can see there are less dots. Here's another example of a dot map showing where the world's population is mostly located. So again, you can see large pockets of population here on the coast of China, in India, Western Europe, along the Nile, right? Coastal regions of the United States. And we can tell because there's more dots there and it ends up looking actually kind of solid. And then here is another example of a dot map. This is all of the locations of McDonald's in the United States. So every dot represents one McDonald's. Okay, more examples of dot maps. Let's talk about choropleth maps. This is the next type that you need to know. And what this does is it puts whatever geographic variable we're looking at into certain classes, right? So you can see in this map, what it does is the cartographer has decided that countries that give 26 weeks or more of paid maternity leave are darkest blue. Countries that give somewhere between 14 to 25 weeks of paid maternity leave are kind of that middle shade, and countries with less than 14 weeks of paid maternity leave are in the lightest blue. And then you can see they've made a very strong distinction here and they've decided, instead of doing another shade of blue, to use red to depict countries where the government does not require any paid maternity leave. Okay, so you can see here that we've got different classes, right? 26 weeks or more, 14 to 25 weeks, or 14 weeks or none, and they have chosen to shade the features on the map in these different colors to show that data. Here's another example, a map of alcoholic drink popularity by country. So again, you can see the different colors are used to represent different types of alcohol. So we can tell from this map that beer is a favorite here in the United States and some of South America. But if you travel over here to Asia, we've got a lot of people that prefer drinking spirits. So that would be like liquor. And then here's another example of the highest paid public employees in the United States. And you can see the shades represent different kinds of positions. So the coaches are represented by these yellow orange or green shades, and not coaches are represented as blue. So you can see the argument being made here, right, is that the highest paid public employees in most states are coaches. Here's another example of a choropleth map where you can see the percent of individuals in poverty by county. So this is actually a pretty large scale map because it's broken down by county rather than what we usually see, which is by state or by city level. The next type is a graduated symbol map. This is where the size of the symbol itself varies in proportion to its frequency. Okay, so for example, these circles here show total energy consumption throughout Europe, and you can see the larger circles represent more energy consumption. Here you can see total murders by state in the United States, so which states had the most murders. California is the obvious winner here. But you can see the size of the circle changes to represent that variable of the amount of murders. Here's another example, and I show you this because I don't want you to mistake graduated symbol and dot maps. They are not the same. Because dot maps, you're going to see the same size dots, but there's going to be more of them as there is more of whatever is being mapped. However, with these graduated symbol maps, you need to be cognizant that it could be any symbol. It could be houses, like for example here. So there are more housing units you can see in these counties in Maryland rather than these ones. Okay, so they didn't use a circle. They chose to use the shape of a house. Okay, so the next one is a cartogram, and cartogram maps, it looks like somebody just kind of like stretched this map out, but it's actually purposefully created this way. And a cartogram uses the space on the page to show changes in variable. So this is not geographically accurate at all, okay? But you can see that these maps here show Olympic game medals. And you can tell by the size of a country whether they have more or less medals. So, you know, some trends here that I can see is that from 1896 to 2012, Africa and South America are the continents with the least amount of Olympic medals, right? And I could make the kind of the opposite argument that Europe and the US or China or Japan here could be argued to have the most Olympic medals. Here's another example. I showed you the world population dot density map, and here's an example of the world population map as a cartogram. So the country itself will expand or get smaller depending on its population in relation to the other ones. So you can tell here that China and India are the most populated countries in the world. And some countries almost disappear because their population is so small. Here's the exact same thing, but on a different visual format. It's the world population, but it's using this grid-based format rather than this more kind of natural rounding format. So toy exports in the world, we can tell that most toys are exported from China. And here are toy imports, so we can tell that Europe and the United States import the most toys. Okay, and then last we have isoline maps. So isoline maps are thematic, like the other ones that we've talked about, but they show a lot of physical features. Okay, so this is kind of hard for people because they might mix it up with a reference map. But ask yourself, is this map telling me a story? And isoline maps absolutely are telling stories. They're explaining what it is like to live somewhere. Right? Sometimes these will also be called topographic maps. And so you can see they're showing things like the average annual temperature in the United States in certain areas. And you can see here is another example in Australia. But we can tell an isoline map is an isoline map because it is lines that are connected to show some sort of similar variable. So you can see this actually it almost makes an entire circle. And then here's the last example of an isoline. We can see the movement of college soccer throughout the years, starting in its hearth here in 1910 and kind of moving inward. Okay, so we're going to stop there for this video. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.